Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Sarah Mackenzie's book, Indigenous Women's Theatre in Canada, A Mechanism of Decolonization. So this is a critical theory book reading the works of three prominent female Indigenous Canadian playwrights, Monique Mojica, Marie Clement, and Yvette Nolan. There are chapters devoted to particular plays that each of those three artists have read, but we've also got Mackenzie's own framework for this argument, which is really where, unless you're actually studying the one of the plays by one of these playwrights, which I actually am studying a play by Yvette Nolan, and I'm writing an article about that, which is why I've read this book. So the chapter on Nolan was of use to me, but it's really the theoretical framework that I think it offers the most sort of broad-based applicability. So this is a decolonial work, and Mackenzie explains what that means in the introduction. She writes of decolonization. It is the outmoding and dismantling of colonial hierarchies, the rebalancing of unequal power relations between Indigenous peoples and white settlers, and the eventual forging of alternative modes of relations. These new relations must be based upon the acknowledgement of the inherent rights of Indigenous people to land and resources. They must be founded upon mutual recognition and the shared desire for the formation of a diverse and interconnected society built upon the principle of human equality. So this is really important. It's really important in this context, a decolonial context, that Indigenous women's theater be taken seriously, be understood, be critically interpreted, and be performed. And a big part of the reason why that is so important is because Indigenous women's experience, I don't want to say more than Indigenous men's experience, because that suggests a comparison that's not necessarily productive, but Indigenous women's experience has been particularly narrativized by colonialism in countries like, especially Canada more so than the US, I would say. Not because the US is particularly better or more ethical than Canada, but because in the US our racism has tended to be directed at African Americans. So Indigenous Canadian anti-Indigenous racism in Canada seems to be much more central to Canadian culture than anti-Indigenous racism is in American culture. At least over the past, at least since about 1900, we'll say that. Earlier, definitely, anti-Indigenous racism was a major component of, say, colonial and frontier American societies. This isn't the point. So colonial ways of figuring the world and figuring Indigenous people have often focused specifically on Indigenous women. My cat is scratching around in the litter box. I don't know if the mic is picking that up. If it is, I apologize. But it's often focused particularly on Indigenous women, largely in sort of three major ways. The first and sort of initial one, the sort of earliest colonial way of figuring Indigenous women was that they align their lives, their bodies particularly, aligned with the idea of virgin territory, right? Terra incognita, this idea of Europeans arriving in the Western Hemisphere and finding it uninhabited. The idea of virgin land that could be taken by European colonizers, was quickly mapped onto Indigenous women's bodies. And so there was a very sort of early connection between Indigenous women as sexual objects for white men and the conquest of North America, South America. So that's one element. Another element is the sort of Orientalist idea in the sense theorized by Edward Said of the exotic other as a sexually lascivious and precocious being, right? The idea that in much the same way that, say, African-American women have often been figured as sexually promiscuous, Indigenous women in Canada have historically been seen as having loose sexual morals and all this bullshit, right? So this is particularly narratives pushed by Christian missionaries, colonizers, etc., Jesuits, and things like this in French Canada, and then obviously like Anglican and Presbyterian ministers in Anglophone Canada, etc. So we got those two. And then the third one, and this is another one that is very heavily aligned with Christianity and the imposition of Christianity on Indigenous Canadians, is seeing women as sexual temptresses, Indigenous women as sexual temptresses, who were sort of tempting white men away from the purity and goodness and Christian restraint and whatever it is of white women. So very clearly, all three of these major ways of figuring Indigenous women focus on their sexuality and their physical bodies, while also assigning them sort of low or compromised moral status in these very sort of puritanical conceptions of sexuality. One problem that has occurred for Indigenous Canadian women, according to Mackenzie, is that heteropatriarchal notions inherent in Christian-rooted colonialism have also made their way into Indigenous cultures. So whereas many pre-colonial Indigenous cultures were either extremely equitable in terms of gender or even matriarchal in some instances, patriarchy and heteronormativity have become elements of Indigenous culture, partially through things like the residential schools system, which in Canada did a lot to undermine Indigenous cultures and replace them with a European Christian colonialist capitalist worldview, but also because Indigenous men, and I don't want to say this as though it's sort of conspiratorial, because it isn't. It's Indigenous men sort of unconsciously but collectively realized that heteropatriarchal norms put them in charge and gave them a degree of power over women that they did not have relative to white settler colonialist society. We often actually see this with oppressed populations, is that heteropatriarchal norms and hierarchies become entrenched, even if they're not necessarily part of a pre-colonial culture, because that gives men within that culture a degree of power and control within their households, over their wives, over their daughters, whatever it is. And that's a very desirable psychological thing, right? When we lack power within our society, we often seek ways of asserting power. And so this is part of the reason why, according to Mackenzie's argument, I tend to agree with this, this is part of the reason why Indigenous Canadian women's drama is so especially important as a decolonial sort of narrative corrective, right? Because you have these colonialist narratives that see Indigenous women in terms almost exclusively of their sexuality, and particularly that figure them as sexually available, which is part of the reason there are such massive rates of sexual violence against Indigenous women, and is almost certainly connected to the incredibly high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada and the US. So you've got that element. But you've also got the emergence of male playwrights, male Indigenous playwrights in Canada, writing about Indigenous issues, and often not presenting particularly sympathetic or positive depictions of Indigenous women. And because those were the plays that initially sort of got picked up as you moved into the sort of post-World War II period, the 60s, 70s especially, and mainstream Canadian theater started to finally pay attention to Indigenous voices. It was primarily Indigenous male playwrights who were getting their work produced. And so that the heteropatriarchal norms that were reflected in those aligned with the perspectives of capitalist Christian settler colonialism to reinforce negative depictions of Indigenous women. So this is essentially the sort of central thing that Mackenzie is interested in. This idea that contemporary Indigenous women's drama resists these narratives, both settler, colonial, capitalist, Christian, heteropatriarchal, but also heteropatriarchal Indigenous narratives about women's experience. And instead, what the plays of these Indigenous female dramatists really do is to reclaim their stories. So even when these playwrights depict violence, particularly sexual violence against Indigenous women, there's a major difference between what traditionally has occurred in Canadian theater and Canadian media more generally, I would say, and what these playwrights are doing. So traditionally, when violence against Indigenous women has been depicted by white-authored Canadian dramatists, or even often by Indigenous male dramatists, it often serves as spectacle. There's a voyeuristic component. And of course, there's a voyeuristic component inherent in theater, but the ways in which we tell stories matter. And if the story of sexual violence is told in such a way that it reinforces narratives that figure Indigenous women as sexually available, as victims, and those are the primary components of their identities, that undercuts the real lived complexity and experience of Indigenous women, particularly as anti-colonial or decolonial subjects. And so what Mackenzie starts her conclusion with is this. Indigenous women's theater has become a crucially important mechanism in the collective feminist and intercultural struggle against racialized gendered violence. Indigenous women's playwrights' expressions of gendered violence function in opposition to colonial tropes that misrepresent indigeneity generally and Indigenous women particularly. Such colonialist tropes have perpetuated broad-based social dismissal of Indigenous peoples as well as racialized and gendered violence. So, by telling Indigenous women's stories, many of which still figure that violence, but figure it often as something to be overcome, something that can and is resisted. Now the automatic litter box is going off. Sorry if the mic is picking this up. Rather than figuring it as spectacle, as, oh, look, sexual violence against Indigenous women, it is presented in the form of critique, right? Critique of settler colonial culture, critique of heteropatriarchy, etc., etc. And so in this sense, these depictions function as decolonial texts, resisting colonial narratives and their imposition of a particular ideology on an oppressed group.